Okay. So Rebecca,
Okay,
take it away.
sure. Okay. So yeah, as Evan said already, thanks so much for coming, especially with this new time. Um, it just works a lot better for us in Australia and Germany with these time changes now to shift the Australian session. Um, so I need to actually be in. There we go. You can all see the slides and they've progressed. Awesome. So we're working our way through the sketch manual, and now we're looking at phonology and prosody, and today we're looking at these in child-directed language, and the next session next month we're looking at phonology and prosody in child language. And so many languages have a register of child-directed language, which is characterized by, or commonly characterized by features such as these, and many of these relate to the phonology or prosody, the way that the language sounds or looks. So, um, particular things like few hesitations and errors, more exaggerated contours, and high pitch, and long duration and pauses. And so we recommend this in the sketch as a kind of good starting off point of common characteristics across languages. And so these are some of the features to look for, but these features might not all be present in the language you're working on, and other features that aren't listed might be present. And also, there may not be a distinct register of child-directed language. It might not be different from adult-directed language. And we've just been looking actually at child-directed language across a few of the languages that we've been working on for the sketches and comparing them. And in kind of doing that, we found several kind of common issues in looking at child-directed language, and particularly also in the phonology and prosody within the sketch format. And one is, of course, there's a lot of variability across individuals in how they talk and how they talk to children, and also in contexts. And with the sketch format, you've got a small number of individuals, and there may be quite different contexts represented in your sketch, or just kind of one, or a couple of quite similar contexts. And so you might see a lot of variability across these individuals, and it can be difficult to work out kind of what the factors for this variability might be, or how that fits in across the whole population or the whole kind of context of language use. So the goal in the sketch, as always, is just to describe that observed variability, and you may not be able to attribute it to specific factors. And another kind of common issue we came across is in the sketch format, there's limited amount of adult-directed language generally. So there's often some adult-to-adult conversation, but it's quite limited in contrast to the child-directed language. And so what many of us did was compare a language that adults directed to younger children versus older children. So comparing typically the language directed to the 2-year-olds versus the language directed to the 4-year-olds. And sometimes also there were older siblings or other children, and you could compare to the language to those older children as well. One way that this kind of was often, in a way, quite helpful is often you had instances where the one adult in the one context, often in kind of the one scene, was talking to a younger child and then to an older child, or vice versa. And so you could really do quite a more direct comparison within that individual person and individual context. But yeah, it's not, you can't talk generalities of child-directed versus adult-directed. And another thing was sometimes there's actually little interaction between the adults and the children in the sketch. There's more just children playing on their own and interacting with each other. And you can still look at child-directed language in these settings. Children, like older children, are known to use child-directed language forms when talking to younger children, sometimes quite exaggeratedly so. And so it's possible to look at this peer interaction and look at, well, how are the older children talking to the younger children? And a comprehensive analysis of the phonology and prosody of child-directed language is likely beyond the scope of the sketch unless you're particularly interested and wanting to delve into that. And also, often we found limitations in the recording setup. So there was often too much background noise, or the microphone didn't pick things up clearly enough to do kind of a really detailed phonetic analysis. It wasn't the goal of the recording setup to be able to do that. So we recommend a kind of pragmatic approach of identifying the most conspicuous differences to adult language quite impressionistically, and you can use your familiarity with the language and what adult speakers of the language are telling you, and then conduct spot checks comparing the language addressed to the youngest versus the oldest children in the corpus, to check these factors that have been raised. And a few other things just to check. So child-directed language, as we said before, is often characterized by specific prosodic features. In many cultures, adults tend to articulate more slowly and clearly. And what can we see as an exaggerated form of adult language? And so this can be seen in kind of pitch and suprasegmental differences, and also changes in the speech and sign rate, long duration, longer pauses, hesitations and disfluencies. So there tend to be fewer hesitations in child-directed language, and also kind of more careful or exaggerated articulation. And I was going to hand over to Lucy here to talk through some examples of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go to the next slide. Okay, so in the Carget sketch, Bigot and colleagues chose to do spot checks on polar questions. So they annotated the corpus, as you can see highlighted here. This is from the manual, from the SAM. They annotated the corpus for speech acts, labelled on a separate tier, so they could easily find them. And they extracted intonation units that contained polar questions, and then they analysed the pitch contours of these polar questions. And they found that these polar questions that were addressed to children up to around the age of 3.5 showed exaggerated pitch movements. And there are a couple of examples that are in the manual, but we've got here on the next slide. And so here in figure 1A, you can see this is a polar question addressed by an adult to a 2-year-old child, and compare that to figure 1B, which is a polar question addressed to another adult. So quite different in terms of their pitch contours. And then next we have some examples from Murimpata. Full disclosure, we haven't finished the phonology section on the Murimpata sketch yet. But in earlier work, Katie Jepson and I found these three particular distinct intonation contours in child-directed language. So there were three distinct melodies, and they seem to have these functions of engaging children, imploring them to do something, and to scold them. So the data we used for this analysis are actually from transcription sessions with caregivers. Some of these transcription sessions we were working on the recordings for the sketch data. Some of them were for the broader corpus, but some were for the sketch data. And we've got some examples of these three melodies. So here's an example of what we call the engage contour. So that's an example to a 2-year-old. So this contour we found it's predominantly used with children up to around the age of 2. It's not exclusively used with children, very young children, but mostly used with very young children. And it's generally used to direct the child's attention to objects and people within their environment. And its features, as you can hear, best align with existing descriptions of CDL prosody in other languages. So, for example, there's a higher pitch in general, a higher F0, and an expanded pitch range. And this contour contrasts with the two other melodies that we found. And we've got examples of those. So the scold melody up the top here. I love this one. So this has an even higher F0 than the engage contour in general. It's generally produced in a shout, as you can hear, although that's not the most extreme example we have. And there's typically a fall in pitch at the right edge, as well as extreme lengthening of the constituent final vowel. So this contrasts with the engage contour, which is quite typical of CDL. And it also... and there's also this implore contour. So this, as you can hear, has a lower pitch register, a relatively flat pitch contour, and considerable vowel lengthening. So and excuse the wayward apostrophe in the translation down there, when we do the rest of the phonology section for the Muripata sketch, we'll look for these particular melodies, which we've already found in the sketch data. We won't find any of the scold contours, I don't think, because I don't think any of the kids were particularly naughty in the recordings we're using. So we'll look for those particular melodies because we know about them already. We'll also do other checks, including the one that Shanley and colleagues did for Inuktitut, which we have examples of in the next slide. So when looking at speech rate in Inuktitut, they define this as the number of syllables per second measured to the nearest tenth of a second. And so they calculated the speech rate of the first 20 utterances by each mother at each age point, so each of the 5 age points. So this is a nice way to analyze speech rate, I think, and we'll be doing something quite similar with the Murimpata data when we do that. So what they found is that the speech rate in child-directed language appears to remain steady, irrespective of the child's age. So you can see that the mean speech rate at the age of 1 year and 4 months is 6.4 syllables per second, and then the mean speech rate at the age of 3 years and 4 months is 6.3 syllables per second. So it remains quite steady. It's basically the same. But as you can see in the next paragraph here, written in the Inuktitut sketch, that there's no baseline speech rate of the mothers because there isn't enough adult-directed speech. So again, this is a caveat that you would put in your sketch, and there's also probably won't be enough data for you to talk fully about individual speaker differences, as Rebecca mentioned to begin with. But still all very worth pointing out. I'll hand back over to Rebecca now.
Thanks so much. So another common divergence from adult-directed phonology is a change in in the phonemes that are used. So adults often report that some phonemes are difficult for children, some sounds difficult for children, and so they tend to make substitutions. So this is really common in the Pindara baby talk, but it's also in English. So you get twain for train, and you get omission or addition of phonemes, so dolly for doll, and reduction of consonant clusters, tummy for stomach. And so you can make note of these kinds of substitutions, changes to the phonemic form of a word when being directed to younger children. And note if there's any kind of regularities that you can see to this. It's also possible that adults might produce more underlying forms and suspend morphophonological changes. And so this was noted in the Carquette corpus and also in previous work by Fry. So it was reported by adults that it was typical to make these realization changes, changing fricatives to plosives and doing reduplication. But this was fairly rarely noticed in the sketch corpus. So there was one case of an S to T. So sup would be to drink, but it's pronounced tup in the sketch corpus, and there were no cases of this reduplication that was reported by Carquette speaking adults. But when looked at a larger corpus of child-directed speech, so Fry collected a series of child-directed narratives. There were 2 examples of this reduplication and 9 of this S to T change. But this is a kind of nice example of how you can take kind of characteristics that the adults in the community note for how they think that they changed their speech direction to young children, and then look for those in the corpus. It's a very good motivation for what to look for in these spot checks and what to be analysing for in the corpus. One really interesting change which they get noted in child-directed speech in Carquette is this emergence of underlying forms. So in adult-directed speech, there's this prominent, you get this article being added to the noun. So you've got this appearing in front of the noun, and then this triggers this intervocalic lenition. And so you're getting, so essentially in many cases, she wasn't sure in describing the adult form whether a noun was initially starting with a plosive or a fricative. Because it always occurred with this preceding vowel, and so the environment was obscuring whether it was a plosive which was being lenited or just an underlying fricative. But in looking at child-directed speech, she found that adults were regularly omitting this otherwise obligatory article, and this allowed the underlying consonant to surface. So here in case this 2-year-old sees a sweet potato and says kaka, sweet potato, and the mother says yes, kukuka, sweet potato, but without that otherwise obligatory article, which allows the plosive form to appear. And she could see that this was actually the underlying plosive appearing rather than it being a change from a fricative into a plosive for child-directed speech, because in other cases, in other words, the fricative would appear here. So it wasn't just a generalized process of substitution. Yeah. And interestingly, I like this example where this 3-year-old says it with the article but doesn't learn it. So this is kind of the core program in looking at child-directed language for phonology and prosody, is to talk with the adults in the community, find out what they see as typical for their language for child-directed speech, and also using the kind of cross-linguistically common set of features that are commonly found, and then use that as a kind of springing off point for what to look for in the corpus, and do cross spot checks throughout the corpus and look for kind of conspicuous prosodic features and report your impressions, and these kind of noted divergences from adult-directed phonology, syllable structure, and also from younger child-directed to older child-directed. And then if you want to, you can expand on this to more systematically measure selected prosodic features that are coming out as being interesting. Thank you. That's all we had prepared in the presentation today. And then we'd like to open it up for discussion.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca and Lucy. So does anyone have any discussion points or questions? I'd like to kick it off.
We haven't started collecting the data yet, and I think it's really useful to be aware that it would be useful to have an adult or an older child present. I hadn't thought of that, and that's really useful.
Mm-hmm.
We've been having a little bit of problems with our ethics committee. They wanted us to indicate at what point we would destroy the data. So we're still struggling with that one. We got some good advice from a number of you, and we've tried to make a case, and we'll wait and see what happens.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. It always seems that ethics committees are a little bit behind the kind of progress in the field.
It's just a nightmare. It's just... we'll get there. I think we'll manage. I think we made a strong case. You gave us good. There was good stuff which I used. And obviously, we would need more. We would need to get permission. We would need to get consent from whoever else is in the recording situation.
Yeah, maybe it's worth Rebecca and Lucy commenting on the presence of other kids in your recordings, of older kids. I mean, in both of you, Gitanjara and Murinpata, it's impossible to record without the presence of other kids, right? Which is very common across many cultures around the world, because kids hang out with each other. So yeah, maybe Lucy or Rebecca, you could comment on the nuts and bolts of that and how it helped in looking at the child-directed language in languages.
So in many cases in my data, the older kids were older siblings, and that made it a lot easier for ethics and consent, because I get consent from the one family for all of the kids. And also for kind of consistency in who the adults were talking to. It was really helpful. I found to go, okay, this is actually talking to that same child in these settings, and how are they speaking There were also many cases where many children came to the recording sessions, and it's very difficult in terms of formal ethics and consent. It also does make it more challenging in a recording wise, just as you've got many more people, it's the recording is harder. And I think this is also something that Lucy did. It was much easier to take a smaller group of people away from the community, and then you've got a more controlled group of people.
Even then, it was kind of difficult to control the numbers getting into the car.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, when I was recording, the few times I recorded in the community, in town, because people wanted to record there, invariably I would just have to stop the recording earlier than I wanted to because this flock of people would come over like, no, stay over there. So that was the end of the recording. That was my way of dealing with it. Like, we'll do it another one later.
No, that's a good way to do it. Yeah, in terms of being useful for analyzing the child-directed language, yeah, I guess I just found it helpful having a fairly wide range of ages in the children in the recordings. So, yeah, there weren't necessarily very many at each age, but it went all the way up from, just older than the focus children through to, 15 years older than the focus children. And so there were teenagers and people all through the age range. And so it was helpful to compare across that. You, Lucy?
I didn't have, it was very dependent on each recording. Sometimes I would have a fair range. I'd also have, but depending on particular families, there might be the whole sibling set that would come along each time. And that was great for continuity at the different ages. Yeah, so and there were, I guess, in the bigger corpus, not talking about the sketch corpus, but the bigger corpus that we took the sketch corpus from, yes, there would be a huge range of ages of kids because of extra people coming along, and it is useful, and yeah, it just gives you, it's more representative of life as well, which is good, and it does give you these extra glimpses because, as you said, Rebecca, that yeah, sometimes older kids use CDL or baby talk in a more extreme way than adults, and yeah, that was the case as well for some people too.
Yeah, and if they're using it, they're not inventing it, right? So if they're using it, then it must be part of the linguistic repertoire of the community itself. And just on the point of having too many people in the recording, I think Serge Sagna was recording in West Africa and had up to like 11 kids in a recording session, and it was a nightmare for him to be able. I think he was really trying to transcribe it all, but talking about it as being like just a massive headache trying to get trying to be able to see who's talking when and all that kind of stuff. So it's a good idea to have multiple children, but maybe limit it to a tractable number.
Definitely.
Sorry, just wondering.
Voices. Sorry, please go ahead.
Yes, you both.
Yeah, sorry, just wondering how, I've never recorded with kids before, so I'm wondering when you have multiple kids, how do you generally record with them? Do you have cardioid microphones for each of them? Do you have lapel mics on each of them, or do you do head mounted? Which one would the kids find the most comfortable?
Yeah, I guess it would be an interesting experiment to see which one the kids found most comfortable. I think various of us have used different setups due to different reasons and then just run with it because that was the setup that we were using. So I put kind of small Zoom recorders on the chest of each of the focus children that I was working with. There were then also other children who were not kind of focus children who were not mic'd up. And I know Lucy used lapel mics. I think the kids probably found the lapel mics more comfortable than the ones I used.
I also, when I briefly did some work a few hours away from the community that Rebecca's done heaps of work in, and tried the Zoom recorders. I was like, yeah, they'll be on the chest. It worked so well for Rebecca. This will be brilliant. And the kids didn't like it at all. Either they wore it on their back, which was okay, but it didn't work as well as a lapel mic being on the front or the Zoom recorder being on the front, or a couple of kids just wouldn't wear them. And so I relied on the a separate like standalone mic to pick up in those recordings. So it's whatever works. But yeah, the lapel mic in little backpacks I used for the Munipat the data, and that works really well with a clip on the front where the kids couldn't take it off. Like a little
I
buckle
was going
clip.
to say this is one of the important things so that it's unobtrusive and the kids don't want to remove it.
Yeah, and it's a bit of trial and error. I thought the ones that I was using in the other community was going to be great because it was light, it was small, but maybe it was just the particular kids, but it didn't really work that well with most.
Oh, yes, that would be my concern with the head mounted. Is that it would just be more obtrusive and easier to take off. And
yeah, my feeling is that head mounted probably works with young infants.
Yeah.
They just they forget that it's there and they can get around. And this is what Mike Frank has done a bit of work on. He has a corpus with Andy Perfors and I can't remember who else, but they've been working on head mounted recordings. But it's really young kids who maybe are not so mobile, not so dexterous with their fingers to be able to interfere with it and things like that.
Yeah, you don't want an amazingly beautiful recording setup that the kids just don't work with at all, because then you don't have anything.
I guess I was asking more wondering, because I was dealing with some child speech data and I found it easier to do qualitative studies on it instead of quantitative study because when I record adult speech, when the recording environment wasn't ideal, I can't even throw it into a database to get a very good tracking. So I was wondering how that was done with child speech, if at all possible.
Yeah. Well, it is possible to get really good quality recordings of child speech, but the sketch contexts are probably not. Well, the recording setups that many of us are using and the format is probably not conducive to very high quality recordings. But it's still possible to do some quantitative analyses. So things like Shanley did with the syllable count, you can go, okay, let's count syllables, and let's just take 20 clear utterances at the start here and go with that. And it becomes much more feasible to do these kinds of sampled quantitative analyses rather than going to say that you're going to analyze this whole stretch in great detail for everything.
Yeah, I think it's hard to do hardcore phonetic kind of analyses on it. But Lucy, with your work with Katie and Murimpata, what were the recordings like for that?
There were transcription sessions outside, like we were having a picnic. And Katie she did the analysis because she's a phonetician. Some of them weren't ideal, but some of them were pretty clear. It depends if the birds are squawking or if we're near a creek. So it kind of depends. You can get quite clear recordings, but you wouldn't want to rely on that sort of recording for phonetic analysis. You can be lucky, but not always.
We had similar kind of things with Murimpata with adults, so we were interested in the interaction between prosody and word order. and we were working with Janet Fletcher, and so I mean we had enough recordings to get enough of we have enough good recordings to analyze this quantitatively, but it was a subset of everything we had because we're recording inside, but field conditions mean that you're just not in a lab with a soundproof kind of booth and all that kind of stuff.
Have we
And
got a rickety air conditioner going?
yeah, and the air conditioner's going because it has to, and things like that. So, I mean, I guess that's different from the sketch data where there isn't as much data as what we would have had from our adults. So, yeah, the kind of analyses that you can do is restricted in that sense. Mhm.
Yeah, that's really fair because the community I've been working with wanted me to record their kids because I was doing very phonetic stuff with the adults, and they were like, "Can you do this with our kids too?" And I was like, "I'm gonna need to go back, revise my ethics, and talk to experts to see what I can do with your kids because they will always be screaming. There will be a million chickens in the backyard. There'll be wind. There'll be birds on the tree." And I was just like, "I'll see what I can do."
Um, it's really interesting. So what was their motivation to ask you to work with the kids? Is it sort of, are they worried about language shift and things like
Language loss, because I work in Vanuatu. The
that?
language itself is pretty strong. It has around 10,000 speakers.
Mhm.
But the kids growing up in Port Vila, the capital, is just losing the language, and they really wanted intervention with that to keep the language going. They're like, it would be great if you can do this, but then there's also code switching. The kids are speaking a lot of Bishama, very little language, and there's just a lot of issues. And they wanted me to do the thing that I'm doing with the adults. They're like, can you do it with kids? I was just like, I don't think they'll sit there and go through 100 words with me, repeating everything 5 times. But
We try and do that sometimes with the kids. We have to train them up. It's really interesting, and this is like the reason why one of the reasons why the sketch approach exists actually. And at least Birgit, I know with her work on Kaket, this is why she started working many years ago with the child language because the community wanted her to do so. And I've actually working with someone else who's from a different part of Vanuatu where I think that you're working in, who's actually a speaker of one of the languages there and is doing it herself. So yeah, it's really interesting that these are the community concerns. Hopefully, we can respond to that.
yes. But I'm just like, I really don't know. They're like, oh, please just record my kid. I was just like, I'm gonna get into serious trouble if I do this time
Yeah.
because my ethics doesn't cover that. They're like, oh, we have disabled people in the community too. I was like, no, not that either. I was just, yeah.
But whatever you do manage to describe will be so useful.
Because it's very interesting. They have such a multilingual community there. Normally, the parents would speak different languages nowadays, and it would be then there is another language used in school. It'll be really interesting to see how the kids are developing, learning sounds.
Did anyone else have
Is there any
anything?
scope in, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. Is there any scope in the actual online version of this acquisition sketch to have recordings in there?
In the manual?
In the sketches themselves, like, yeah, so that people who are accessing them online can play examples.
So from the journal, yes, there's the possibility to embed media files and link to them in the publication and publish those as part of the sketch in the online version, of course. And then it just comes down to whether you want that, whether your consent includes that, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But it's possible within the journal. Yeah.
Thanks.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you had mentioned talking with adults in the community to kind of ask them what kind of things they do with kids. And I was just sort of wondering, is this kind of informal? Is this something more systematic? And then you're like trying to look for those things in the corpus, or how does that work?
I've done it more kind of informally. And so just as part of talking with adults about child language and how they talk with kids and kind of what do they see as typical for how you talk to kids and why do you talk to kids differently, and just kind of having these kind of more general conversations and then the themes that have come up from that. But it would be very possible to do that in a more formalized way and have kind of a set of questions that you ask everyone. I know, Lucy, you've done a bit more kind of consistent interviews with adults.
For Barb, yeah. I was trying to. It felt a bit contrived, I have to say. I prefer the informal, like transcription session. Something comes up and an adult comments, and then I go, "Oh, really?" and then encourage them to elaborate. Yes, Barb and I were looking at caregiver ideas around language learning. It was more just I try to casually pop in a couple of questions as we were fishing or something, which probably didn't sound very casual at all. But I did try to ask particular questions to every caregiver I could at an appropriate moment. But that's as formalized as it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess with more formal situations, there can be a danger that you're creating a kind of situation in which people answer pro-socially rather than in answering it in ways that might reflect actual behavior. Yeah.
Alan Ramsey and Francesca Merlin have done a sort of more formal type like survey that they were able to have run by a Kuaru man, so like sort of by another community member with, I think it was 11 other Kuaru adults. And that seems to have been really productive. And like they have a list now of like 30 like nursery talk lexical items and like all sorts of descriptions about how adults perceive themselves and other people as talking to kids. So that seems to have been really, useful.
Mm. Yeah, I think it can be really useful, and it can help to have a list of kind of prepared questions and things that you're going to try and ask everybody. Myself, it kind of goes back to Evan's point. I'd be wary of formalizing it too much in getting kind of in influencing how people answer. And also, I've just found that in kind of more informal chats, people have elaborated in more depth than they have in more what they've perceived to be more formalized settings. And in these kind of informalized chats, I've still been able to get a lot of detail and a lot of kind of consistent detail in what people are reporting about Pidindara child-directed language. And, a long list of nursery lexicon items and consistent ideas of why adults may talk to children differently and how they go about changing their language. So, but I think it just really depends on your field environment and your relationship with the community, and also what your goal for doing this is. If you're wanting to, say, write a separate paper or a more formalized analysis of caregiver ideas of child-directed language, then you might want to formalize that more and look at your method for how you're doing that and make sure that there's more consistency in that. If it's more about exploring community ideas of child-directed language to build a set of kind of community-informed features that you're going to be looking for in the sketch alongside the kind of more literature-informed set of features, then I think it's fine to just have these casual chats with different people. It just depends on what your motivations are.
I definitely found the chats that I've had in transcription sessions when it's been prompted by something we've heard that the child said or an adult said or whatever, much more fruitful than when I was trying to ask the same questions. And I was trying to do it smoothly, but still so much more productive when it just occurred naturally. And I knew the people well who I was asking the questions to, but also just culturally, it's a bit strange to ask questions in that context that's not obviously immediately relevant. So I guess that's probably why it was more productive in the transcription session when it arose naturally. And the caregiver themselves started talking about it, and I just nudged them to elaborate a bit. But yeah, completely context dependent.
Yeah. I think it also really helps when it's in context and the person you're talking to has that context of they've just observed something in child-directed language and then they can talk about that. Whereas if they're just trying to think how does this work, and you're just trying to imagine, then it's very hard to do that. Even for myself how do English speakers talk to kids?
I definitely got humorous, I don't know.
Yeah.
So are the parents usually there during the transcription? I guess, it varies probably a lot, but it sounds like for yours, they're there.
It does vary. I try to get them there. Yeah.
It just helps if not a parent, then a caregiver who knows the child really well, especially with the young children, because there's such idiosyncratic ways of pronouncing things, and also what they're interested in, what they do day to day. It just helps with working with someone who's really familiar with the particular child or children.
I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to ask one more question. I know transcription takes a long time. So are you compensating the parents for helping with the transcription, or are they just agreeing? Yeah.
Oh, yes. That's where most of the money goes. They work hard and they deserve that money.
Yeah, I think if you're a native speaker of the language you're working on, like Sandra's probably, maybe wouldn't need to have parents working with her on the transcriptions, but I mean, in cases of Murimpat and Pitjantjatjara, it certainly helps, right? Rebecca and Lucy.
For us outsiders, definitely.
Definitely.
We don't actually have money yet. We're trying to work on try and get some kind of funding. So it would be difficult anyway to pay them. And you couldn't expect that kind of work. It's too hard. It's hard work. We couldn't expect the parents to do it without being compensated in some way.
Yeah, it is really hard going, that work.
Just one thing which keeps coming to me as everyone else speaks. Our community is really quite different. We're not going to have chickens in the background, thank goodness. I'm not very fond of chickens, but I think our concern, and sometimes something we are aware of, is that the families who agree to do this are likely to be people who have an interest in language, and obviously that could, with such a small number of participants, it could introduce a bias which would be best avoided. So we're conscious of this and we will try to offset it, but
yeah.
The pilot family, we already have a pilot lined up. As soon as ethics say we can go ahead, we have a family lined up already, but the mother, I think, is a speech therapist. So obviously be aware of language and the rest. And if we have to make sure that we don't get all our participants don't have that kind of background, because it will bias it.
Yeah. This is one thing, it's in any study, but it's particularly salient in the sketch with a small number of people, is that there's going to be a bias in the data. Even if you work with 100 kids, there's going to be a bias in the kids that, or the families that come and work with you. And you can acknowledge that, and it's not going to be everybody in the community does it this way necessarily, but also, even if it's biased, even if it's just that one person or these few people, they're not going to be getting their behavior, their language, what they're doing in these recordings from nowhere. It's going to be reflecting generally what's in the community. They're not going to be doing something completely different. And you can see that in in some of the older child-directed language that I've seen, and it's like, oh, wow, that is really exaggerated. And I'm not seeing adults do that. That would be kind of unusual. That would be really biased if I said, okay, this is their child-directed language. But they're not getting that from nowhere. They're just reflecting patterns that are in the adult child-directed language that I've seen there. And it's just a bit more. And it's kind of on this continuum. And yes, it's more this way, but it's still phenomena in the community in that space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I guess I agree with Rebecca in the sense that no study is unbiased in its sampling, right? And I think this is perhaps something that in the history of the field we hadn't really reckoned with, or really it was something in the background. Like all the early recordings are often of middle class white American children learning English, and often are recordings of child language acquisition research as children, right? And that taught us something about the process. Maybe sometimes we took those as being representative of the average child learning English, but it's a start, and I think this is the point of the sketch as well. That if no data exists in these languages, then and something like there's no corpus in Maltese, then actually, if you had 5 children or 10 children of only speech therapists, but they were all learning Maltese, that's the beginning of the process. And I think what Rebecca was saying as well is that acknowledging this and understanding the limits of the generalizability is basically something that runs right through the sketch, because with so few children, with so few hours, we can never really be completely sure about the patterns that we find are representative, but at least they're pointing us in the direction of how acquisition might work in the language. So it's great that you're concerned about it. I wouldn't be too worried about it, because it will always be something that's going to be there, and acknowledging it means that showing you're aware of it.
I mean, definitely though, the what I got, like this one important element which we hadn't actually thought of, was having an older child or another adult present. I think that will make a difference, because then there will be a little bit less focus on just the caregiver and the child, but someone else coming in is bound to make it more natural.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have 11 kids in the car. So
if you don't have chickens as well, your recordings will be.
We won't have chickens, we won't have 11 kids.
And it's great that you got people who are keen. That's fantastic.
Okay, so we're just at the top of the hour now. So unless anyone has a burning desire to ask a final question, I guess we can finish up.
Just want to say thank you for organizing these sessions. They're really, really useful. Very, very useful. Thank you.
Our pleasure. And thank you. And so we'll pick up again next month on child phonology and prosody. Well,
Lovely.
hopefully
Okay,
Thank you.
Nice day or night. Okay, good night. Good day.